Thank you very much. Before we kick off with an exciting chat with Geoff, just to remind you, please hit subscribe to this channel. We're not yet a #1 best selling podcast like Geoff White, but we're getting there. And also follow on Apple Podcasts and rate and review us, particularly if you like us. Emily and Alice, over to you. You divvy it up, please, your questions for Geoff.
A really interesting book here on the table, which you can definitely see really well because of how I positioned it. It's by this guy called Geoff White. Has anyone heard of him?
I don't know, because there's also a very interesting book in the background. If for anybody who's watching this, there's a very interesting, more recent book in the background for Geoff called Rinsed. But there's also, of course, award-winning podcast 2 series, the Lazarus Heist, which is a real deep dive into North Korean hackers. Absolutely brilliant. And most recently, of just a few weeks ago, wasn't it, Geoff, a documentary From Russia to Redcar, looking at the impact of major ransomware attack on a city council up in the northeast of England. Geoff, before we kind of go into, the detail of your work, I would love to know, how you got into being an investigative reporter, because what led you into it, and because you go to places that most people would be fearful of. I remember going to a talk of yours a few years ago, and you asked the audience, who's been on the dark web? And about 3 people put their hands up, and you were like, why would you not go on the dark web? But there is something a bit different about the way that you really get into it. You talk to hackers, you talk to cyber criminals, you're really getting into the depth. What led you into this?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I worked for a long time for Channel 4 News, one of the big news programs in the UK, one of the leading news programs in the UK. And I was covering tech, and at the time tech was, Apple iPod launches and games and gadgets, and it wasn't really taken very seriously. And I looked at what was actually happening behind the scenes. I was looking at crimes committed by organized crime gangs. I was looking at frauds committed. I was looking at nation state hacks and thinking, this is big news, it's important news. And in terms of dark web stuff, that was where it was all going on. That's where they were all hanging out and they were chatting, and you could visit there. I regarded myself, and this wasn't a popular view at Channel 4 News, I suspect, but I regarded myself as being a foreign correspondent. Places like the dark web are new territory. You have to know how to get in. You've got to know how to apply for the right visas. When you get there, they use a whole different language and a whole different currency. Well, that's kind of like being a foreign correspondent. You go to places, you travel to places, and you come back with a dispatch from it. So that's how I sort of regarded it. In terms of getting into the investigative stuff, that's sort of more of a function of maybe a psychological defect for me, in that I can't put stuff down. I have to get to the end of things. And as you'll well know, particularly from TV news, it's very, very surface and very shallow. It's like today, you're covering Nicolas Sarkozy's visit to the UK. Tomorrow, it's Taylor Swift. And I just couldn't adapt to that. I couldn't adapt to the idea that you just forget something you did yesterday and do a new thing today. I always wanted to finish the thing that we'd done. And so there's a slight obsessive quality there. And I think that's what most investigative journalists have. They're people who just keep pulling the thread until there's no jumper left. And so that's what
And Geoff, just a quick interrupt there, but I'm really pleased to hear that you're thinking of tech. The scope of tech is not just physical gadgets. I mean, we've been working with internet technology and security and all of these sorts of things, and they're really hard to hold in your hand.
Well, yeah, one of the reasons, there were 2 things really I started doing at Channel 4 News. One was the tech security side, and the other was the personal data side. Both of which, by the way, quite prescient areas to get into back in 2014 or 2012, whenever I started doing it. And the thing that made me interested in the personal data thing was I went past a branch of, I think it was Dixon's or Curry's or one of the high street, box companies, and there was a power cut. And so everything in the window was off, and there were TVs and there were phones and there were tablets. And I was like, shit, they're all just black squares. They're all just black squares of plastic. And I suddenly had this moment where I realized, it's not about, we've been thinking about the kit. We've been doing the product launches of all these Apple products and Android. It's like, no, it's not about the actual physical thing. The thing we care about is that's a window to the data. It's actually the data behind it that's a really important thing. It sounds obvious now, but for me at that time, it was like, we've been so obsessed with these tech gadgets. And suddenly I realized That's just the window. You're literally just buying a window. Everything important is through that window.
And also, I think that's you've just given an example of the other aspect of an investigative reporter such as yourself, is the ability to forget what you knew and remember what it was like to not know that, and be able to convey those complex things simply. Alice, you were talking about.
Yeah, I was watching your it's a series, and so I was watching the beginning of it, your investigation into ransomware. And on this show, I've had a ransomware expert explain what ransomware is to me, and I thought I understood it. And within 5 minutes of watching your show, I realised I didn't understand ransomware, but now I do. And that, I just assumed that ransom meant some kind of like code or something that I didn't understand with my non-technical brain. And actually, it literally just means ransom. It means like holding some software to ransom, or being like, oh, we'll delete all your files if you don't pay us some money. And it's like, it's actually a very old-fashioned crime, and you just made it so accessible. And yeah, I think it's amazing how easy it was to understand just within 5 minutes. It's actually, these concepts don't have to be this complicated.
It's really kind. Yeah, thanks for that. And ransomware is an interesting one in that it is simply a crime of extortion. That there's nothing more to it than that. You extort somebody. That is a crime that's as old as civilization, because since people have valued something, there's somebody out there who will take it off them. What's interesting about an extortion crime, extortion is not a good crime to start. If you're thinking of going into crime, don't start with extortion. It's actually quite hard to pull off. To do extortion successfully, you need to master two things. Number one, you need to negotiate with your victim. There's always that period of negotiation. It's a vulnerable period, because vulnerable to interception. If you give away where you are or who you are, the police can come and arrest you. Also, you have to somehow, and this is the really difficult bit about extortion that applies to ransomware, but any extortion, you have to make the victim trust you, that when they pay up, you are going to return to them the thing they value. But you're naturally not to be trusted because you're a criminal. So how do you square that circle? You have to do a very, very careful psychological manipulation of your victim to make them acknowledge that you're a criminal, but that you can actually be trusted. That's a difficult one to do. And the second big problem with extortion has always been payment. It's the classic bit in the Hollywood movie where, leave the money at the bus stop and I'll return your children. And obviously, as soon as the victim leaves the money at the bus stop, the criminal goes to get the money at the bus stop and the cops pounce. The answer to that, and this is why ransomware has exploded as a criminological phenomenon, was, of course, cryptocurrency. Suddenly you can use it well, anonymous payments internationally. So that's why ransomware as an extortion type has taken off, is because it's solved that second key problem of how do you get the money. The first problem of how you get trust among your victim, that's still actually a challenge for ransomware gangs.
I mean, we had Kieran Martin on our podcast a few weeks ago, and he was talking about in the context of the Marks and Spencer's attack, manufacturing fear and selling relief. But there is there is that promise, isn't there, that they have to fulfill, that they will actually give you that relief and unlock your business. But you think of Marks and Spencer's, and I know Emily wants to talk to you a bit about this, because we're fascinated at the destruction of this national icon, this giant store, through weaknesses in the internet supply chain, it seems, and ability to extort. Emily.
Yeah, Geoff, there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about, but let's follow this thread of the ransomware gangs. And as you were speaking about, actually, some of the operational difficulties of cashing out in ransomware, it reminded me of your award-winning podcast series, the Lazarus Heist, and how deeply you got into the techniques of the North Korean gang, and actually how incredibly logistically complex, particularly the jackpotting of ATMs. And if you're listening to this, I do recommend that's it really from series 2, but that there was hundreds of people in a coordinated sort of movement to get money out of ATMs in India and lots of other countries at the same exact time, and then how do you get that cash back to North Korea? So it's agents on the ground, it's networks in country, it's also going through the dark web and agents there. So I think that this is something that, for me, your work really brings to light, is this isn't just the cat madly typing on a keyboard like we have at the beginning of our show. This is actually very detailed, well-planned stuff, and North Korea is particularly good at it. So I'd love your comments on that. I'd also love your thoughts on sort of the connection between the Lazarus gang and the state of North Korea. Yeah,
it's very interesting. I mean, look, the point about the money, that's why I wrote a book about money laundering. The book I wrote last year, it's out in paperback this year, so you can get it even cheaper in July. Because I realized, look, the tech security stuff I'm fascinated by, the hacking I'm fascinated by, but frankly, a lot of the time, all I can really explain to the audience is somebody got a dodgy email and they clicked on it and they got infected. Behind the scenes, malware analysis is a fascinating thing, and how you actually infect somebody's machine is really, really interesting, if you're interested in that. But the really interesting stuff is actually, once they've got their hands, if you like, digitally on the money, how these criminals, including the Lazarus Group, the North Korean government hackers, how do they actually move it and extricate it? And if you look at that podcast, the Lazarus Heist, and the book that I wrote about it as well, actually, people say it's a podcast about North Korean hacking. Actually, no, if you look at it, about half the story at any one time is about laundering. It's got nothing to do with tech at all. And how do you actually extricate that money? And what's interesting is all organized crime types, whether it's cartel drug dealing, prostitution, child sexual abuse, fraud, or hacking, that are money motivated, all face the same challenge. How do you pull the money out at the other end? And what we've seen in terms of money is obviously this increased digitization of finance. I can't frankly remember the last time I held cash. I don't really carry cash anymore. No. So finance has been digitizing for a while and now is increasingly digitized. We've also got this whole new wave of what you might call new finance, I guess, depending on how old you are, of cryptocurrency. So you've got these swathes of technology coming into finance. Now, in terms of a money launderer, that's great, because suddenly you can do a whole bunch of stuff digitally you couldn't do before, and you can do a whole bunch of stuff digitally outside of banks that are quite good at spotting crime often with things like crypto. The problem, the downside is, if everything's digital, it's then so much more traceable. If you're a crook and you've got $1 million in cash, it's cash. You can't link it necessarily to the crime. Digitally, there's always a trace back. You can always trace back the path, whether it's traditional finance or whether it's through cryptocurrency. And I think a lot of people don't really realize that about crypto, is that there is this immutable ledger, and that can lead you back to the criminal. Lucian, you wanted to move on, or maybe it's time for Geoff's guilty pleasure.
Oh yes, I think before we dig into I did want to answer a couple of ask a bit about those points, but before that, it's time for our guilty pleasure online.